The auction lasted maybe 4 minutes, and nobody wanted the tractor. It was a 1,960 seconds International harvester, rusted through the fenders, flat tires, and a diesel tank crusted shut. The auctioneer almost skipped the lot until Walt raised one hand from the back of the room. $300. And the wholesale ring laughed, because Dale Harper called it a junkyard special before Walt even loaded it on the trailer. Nobody thought about that tractor again for 2 years, which was exactly how long Walt needed to finish what he'd started in secret. The sale barn sat at the east edge of Cedar County, and on a cold Saturday in March it smelled like wet canvas and diesel exhaust and the coffee they kept warm in a dented steel pot by the door. The place was almost empty. By noon the crowd had thinned out because the good lots had already gone, and most folks only came for those, and the ones who stayed for the company more than the inventory. The auctioneer had been at it since 8 in the morning, and his voice had gone hoarse from calling bids that nobody answered, and by the time he reached the back row, he was ready to be done. What was left sat under a gray tarp that flapped in the wind, and he walked past it twice before he stopped and turned back. Lot 41. He pulled the tarp back and read from the card without much hope. A 1,960 seconds International harvester, row crop model. No badges left, tires flat, the seat torn down to the foam. The diesel tank was crusted shut at the cap, and a robin had built a nest in the exhaust stack sometime the previous spring. He read the opening bid low, then lower, then waited. Nobody moved. Walt Briggs stood at the back of the room with his hands in the pockets of an old canvas coat. He was 61 that winter, widowed 5 years, and he ran 140 acres of bottomland that nobody had ever called easy. He'd farmed it with a series of second-hand machines, none of them new, all of them fixable, and he'd never once called the dealer for a service truck. His father had taught him mechanics on machines older than these, and he'd carried the lesson his whole life, which was that a man who could fix his own iron was a man who could keep farming no matter what the market or the supply chain decided to do. The auctioneer looked his way, and Walt raised one hand, just the one, no paddle, no hurry. $300. The room turned, and somebody in the front row let out a short laugh that caught and spread. Dale Harper was already standing, because Dale never sat through an auction. He was the county's loudest voice on new equipment, ran a nearly new tractor with a heated cab and a touchscreen. He liked to show off at the diner, and he believed, with his whole chest, that anything older than him was in the way. "That thing's a junkyard special," Dale said, loud enough that the back row heard it plain. "You're gonna haul that home, Walt?" Walt nodded once. "I am." Dale shook his head, grinning, and a couple of men behind him grinned with him, because Dale had a way of making a joke feel like the whole room's opinion. He leaned toward the man next to him and said something about scrap prices that got a laugh, and Walt heard it and didn't turn his head. The auctioneer looked around the room one more time, and when nobody countered, the gavel came down 3 times and the tractor belonged to Walt for the cheapest price paid all day. He paid the clerk in cash, counted out slow from a roll he kept in his coat, walked out to his truck, and backed the trailer up to the lot while the crowd moved on to the next sale. Ray helped him load it. Ray was Walt's nephew, 24, back from a job at a parts counter in the city, and staying in the little house behind the shop until he figured out his next move. He wasn't a farmer, not yet, but he could turn a wrench and he didn't mind the cold, and he'd come to the auction mostly to keep Walt company. He looked at the tractor and then at Walt and said nothing for a long moment. "What are you actually going to do with it?" Ray asked as they chained the axles down. Walt checked the binders and tugged the chain once to test it. "Get it running." Ray looked at the rusted stack, the nest falling out of it, the tires sitting flat on the trailer. "On what?" Walt climbed into the truck and pulled the door shut. "We'll see." They drove home slow with the hazard lights blinking, and the tractor swayed on the trailer through every turn. 2 trucks passed them heading the other way, and both drivers recognized Walt's rig and the shape on the back. And by supper time, the county had decided that old Walt had finally bought something sillier than the rest of his fleet. Nobody thought to ask what he'd seen in it, because nobody believed he'd seen anything at all. The tractor sat in the shop for 3 days before Walt touched it because he wanted to look at it first. He walked around it morning and evening with a cup of coffee in his hand, the way a man walks around a field before he decides where to break it. Ray watched from the doorway and kept his doubts to himself because he'd learned that Walt's silences usually meant something. On the 4th morning, Walt dragged a work light over and started at the data plate. The bolts were rusted solid, and he had to soak them in penetrant and wait an hour before they'd turn, and even then, 2 of them twisted off, and he had to pick the stubs out with a pick and a pair of pliers. The plate came off caked in grime, and he carried it to the bench and cleaned it with a rag and a little solvent, until the stamping showed through, letter by letter, the way a message comes up out of the mud. A 1,960 seconds International Harvester, row crop, diesel option, built before anything on that tractor talked back to a computer. What the crowd had missed, Walt had not missed. The old International Harvester row crop tractors were built in a time when a farmer burned whatever fuel he could get his hands on, and the engines were designed for it. The same block could burn gasoline, kerosene, distillate, LP gas, or diesel, depending on what a man had on hand. The engineers who drew it assumed the man driving it would never have a parts counter on every corner, and would have to make do with what the season gave him. That was the seed of the whole plan, and it had been sitting in the back row of the sale barn under a gray tarp, while the whole room laughed at the man who'd seen it. Walt climbed up and opened the hood, which took a hammer and a block of wood to free. The engine was dirty but complete, and he laid his hand on the intake manifold, and the injection pump and the head, in turn the way a doctor lays a hand on a patient before he speaks. An injection pump that was stiff but not seized was worth more than anything the auctioneer had said all day. Scored cylinders weren't deep enough to scrap the block, and the bearings turned without grinding, which told him the crank had been oiled when it was parked and hadn't sat dry. Everything electrical was dead from one end to the other, and Walt counted that as good news, because there was almost no electrical to speak of, and what little there was could be replaced with a spool of wire and a handful of connectors he already had in a drawer. Ray came in with 2 sandwiches and handed one over. So it's a diesel. It is. Can you make a diesel run that's been sitting since before I was born? Walt chewed and looked at the engine for a while. The hard part isn't making it run. Ray waited. What's the hard part? Walt set the sandwich down and pointed at the injection pump with the handle of a screwdriver. The hard part is what I want it to run on. He didn't say more than that, and Ray knew better than to push. Walt wasn't being coy. He was being careful, because a plan you talk up before you've tested it turns into just a story, and Walt had no use for stories he hadn't proven with his hands. But that evening, after Ray had gone to the little house, Walt sat on a stool in front of the tractor and let the idea settle, the way he let a field settle before he planted it. If the engine had been built to burn whatever was handy, then whatever was handy in a real pinch might not be diesel at all, and might not come from any pump the county owned. The rebuild took the rest of the winter and most of the spring, and Walt did it the way he did everything, slow and by hand, and in the evenings after the chores. He tore the engine down on a Saturday with Ray's help, and they spread the parts on the bench in rows and labeled them with tape, because there was no manual in the shop and no parts diagram on a screen. It was slow going. Cylinders needed honing, and he rented a hone and did it himself, feeding it steady and keeping the stones wet until the cross-hatching came back clean. Valves needed reseating, and he lapped them by hand with grinding compound and a suction tool, turning each one until the seat showed an unbroken ring of gray. The injection pump was the part that worried him, because a bad pump would waste everything else. He broke it down on the bench, under a magnifying light, cleaned the gallery, replaced the 2 plungers that were scored, and put it back together with a new gasket he cut by hand from a sheet of material he'd been saving for years. The first time he timed it, the marks didn't line up, and he did it again, and then a third time, until the pump clicked over exactly when the mark said it should. Not everything went smooth. A head bolt stripped on a Tuesday, and he spent the whole next day drilling it out and retapping the hole by hand, and Ray found him at midnight still filing the threads clean under the work light. A gasket he'd cut leaked on the first test, and he pulled the cover again and made a new one, and sealed it with a thin bead of copper compound, and he watched it for an hour the next morning before he trusted it. The fuel lines were crusted inside, and he ran a wire through each one and flushed them with solvent until they ran clear, and even then he wasn't sure, because a line that looks clean can still hold a film that gums an injector at the wrong moment. He replaced 2 of them with line he had on a spool, bent to shape over a coffee can, and flared the ends by hand with a tool his father had left him. There was a Thursday in April when the tractor sat half-assembled, and the shop was cold and the work wasn't going anywhere, and Ray brought over a pot of chili and 2 bowls, and they ate sitting on overturned buckets beside the engine block. They didn't talk about the tractor. Ray told a story about a customer at the parts counter who'd ordered the wrong filter, 6 weeks running, and Walt laughed in a way Ray hadn't heard in a long time, and for a little while the project didn't feel like a wager against the whole county. The first start came on a Sunday evening in May, after the chores and after Ray had gone home. Walt bled the fuel lines by hand, cranked the pump until diesel ran clean at the injectors, and hooked a charged battery to the starter. He turned the key and the engine turned over slow, and turned over slow again, and on the 3rd try it caught with a cough that put a blue cloud out the exhaust. It ran rough, shaking on its mounts, and then it smoothed out as the cylinders warmed, and the sound settled into a low, steady thump that filled the shop and rang off the tin walls and came up through the soles of his boots. Walt let it run. He listened to it the way he listened to a heartbeat, his hand on the fender feeling for a miss or a knock. The engine was even. The temperature climbed and held. He shut it down after 20 minutes and stood in the quiet that came after. And he wasn't smiling, because running on diesel was the easy part, and he'd known it would run on diesel before he ever bought it. Ray came back the next morning, and the engine was cool, and the shop smelled like exhaust, and Walt was already under the hood measuring something. "It ran," Ray said. "Not a question. It ran." Ray leaned in the doorway and watched Walt work for a minute. "So you're done?" Walt shook his head once. "Running on diesel just proves it isn't dead. Anybody's tractor can run on diesel. That was never the point." "What was the point then?" Ray asked. And he pulled up a bucket and sat on it, because he'd learned that Walt would answer a direct question if you gave him the room. Walt looked up from the pump and wiped his hands on a rag. "The point is a tractor that runs on something I can make, that I can fix with what's in this shop, and that doesn't need a man 3 towns over with a password to tell it it's allowed to work." That week, a man named Curtis, who lived 3 farms over, drove past on the county road and saw the shop doors open and the tractor sitting inside, cleaned and whole, and no longer flat. He mentioned it at the diner, and by the weekend the story had made the rounds, and the county's opinion hadn't changed much. Old Walt had gotten the junk to start, which was a curiosity and a little impressive, but it was still an old diesel tractor doing what old diesel tractors did, and nobody saw a reason to trade in a heated cab for it. Dale heard the story and laughed, and said the junkyard special had finally learned to crawl, and the table laughed with him, and that was the end of it for everyone but Walt. The barrels started showing up behind the shop in June. Walt put the word out quietly, the way he did everything, that he'd take waste oil off anyone's hands for free, and the county was glad to be rid of it. The diner brought their fryer oil in 5-gallon buckets, the garage brought drained motor oil in jugs, and a couple of farmers brought hydraulic fluid they drained out of old implements. Ray stacked the barrels in the shade and labeled each one with what was inside, because Walt had told him the first thing they'd learn was what not to mix, and the second thing they'd learn was that the same word, oil, covered a dozen different liquids that behaved nothing alike in an engine. A smell settled behind the shop that got worse before it got better, and a neighbor's dog took up a post by the barrels and wouldn't be moved. The work was ugly and slow. Walt built a filter rig out of a barrel, a pump, and a stack of cloth and paper media, and he ran the waste oil through it in stages, coarse to fine, until what came out the bottom was clean enough to see light through. Even then it wasn't ready, because water hid in the oil and had to be settled out, and bits of food and grit would plug a filter in an hour if he rushed it. Ray spent whole afternoons changing filter cloths and scraping sludge, and the shop took on a smell that didn't wash out of clothes. The first time they tried to run the tractor on straight waste oil, it sputtered and knocked and stalled inside of a minute. The oil was too thick, too cold, and too full of the wrong things, and the injection pump couldn't move it. Walt pulled the injectors and found them gummed with a varnish that smelled like an old frying basket, and he spent the better part of a week cleaning them and re-shimming them by hand, soaking the nozzles in solvent, and picking the orifices clean with a wire the size of a hair. Ray didn't say "I told you so," but his face said it for him. And after the third stall, Walt let him say it out loud because he'd earned it. "I told you," Ray said, holding up a clogged nozzle. Walt took it and turned it to the light. "You did. Now hand me the solvent." Walt worked the problem the way he worked ground, in straight rows and one at a time. The oil had to be heated before the pump could move it, because heat thinned it out, and he built a heat exchanger off the engine coolant that warmed the oil on its way to the pump. He added a second tank, a small one for diesel and a bigger one for waste oil, with a valve on the dash to switch between them. The idea was to start on diesel, let the engine and the heat exchanger come up to temperature, switch over to waste oil once it was hot and thin enough to burn, and switch back to diesel before shutdown, so the lines didn't coke up and set like glue overnight. It worked, and it didn't. The tractor would run on heated, filtered waste oil for a quarter hour, and then smoke and lose power, and Walt would switch back to diesel and let it clean out and try again the next day. Some runs it held for half an hour before it started to bog, and some runs it quit at 5 minutes, and Walt couldn't always tell why, which was the part that gnawed at him. He kept a ledger and grease pencil on a board by the bench, and he wrote down every run, the temperature, the blend, how long it held, and what it did when it failed. The ledger filled up with more failures than wins, and the wins were the ones that taught him the least, because a win that you can't repeat is just luck wearing the disguise of a result. Dale drove past one afternoon and saw the barrels and the filter rig and the hose running from the second tank, and he pulled in and leaned on the fence and laughed in the easy way he had. "Running a tractor on French fry grease now, Walt." Walt didn't look up from the valve he was adjusting. "Working on it." "You ought to just buy diesel like everybody else," Dale said, still grinning. And he drove off and told the story at the diner, and the county had another good laugh at Walt's expense. Ray heard about it secondhand and came back to the shop annoyed on Walt's behalf, and Walt shrugged and told him that a man who's right doesn't need to argue with a man who's loud. By the end of the summer, the tractor would run on waste oil, reliably for an hour at a stretch, as long as it was hot, and the filter was clean, and the oil had been settled right. It smoked more than Walt liked, and it smelled like the back of a diner, and it wasn't the answer. It was close to something, and Walt could feel it, but it wasn't there yet, and the ledger told him so in his own handwriting. The problem with straight waste oil was that it was too thick and too slow to burn clean, and Walt knew he needed something to thin it and help it combust. He tried a little gasoline first, cut into the oil in a small batch, and the engine ran hot and sharp and wrong, and he shut it down fast and didn't try gasoline again, because a man who'd kept all his fingers this long didn't risk them for a fuel experiment. That settled it. He thought about it for a week, and then he went to see a man named Harlan, who lived at the far edge of the county, and who'd been making ethanol on a farm scale for years, not for anything illegal, just for fuel and for the doing of it. Harlan sold him a drum of ethanol and told him more than he asked about how to keep it dry, because ethanol would soak up water out of the air, and water was the enemy of any fuel system. Walt listened and took notes in the ledger, and hauled the drum home and set it up on a stand in the shop, with the cap sealed tight. The idea was simple enough in his head, which was that the ethanol would thin the waste oil and add oxygen to the burn, and together they might do what neither one did alone. Simple in his head did not mean simple in the engine. Ethanol and oil didn't want to mix, and the first batch he shook up separated inside of an hour, a dark layer below and a clear layer above, and the tractor wanted no part of a fuel that came apart in the tank. Walt fought it for weeks. He tried different ratios, 4-to-1 and 3-to-1 and 5-to-1, and he tried warming the oil before he blended and blending in small batches and keeping the drum rolled to mix it. Some days it held and the tractor ran clean and strong, and some days it separated and the engine coughed and Walt went back to the ledger and started over. He landed on a method by trial and error and a lot of greasy notes. First he heated the waste oil, cut the ethanol in while it was warm, kept the blend moving with a small pump until it stayed together, and ran it through the filter rig warm so nothing separated on the way to the tank. The ratio he settled on was mostly waste oil, with enough ethanol to thin it and carry oxygen, and he wrote it on the board in grease pencil and circled it. He tested it 3 mornings, running before he trusted the result, letting the blend sit overnight and checking it at dawn to see if it had come apart, and each morning it held the same dark amber all the way down the jar, and that was when he knew he had something worth putting in a tank. The day he plowed his own field on the blend, Ray stood at the fence and watched. Walt had switched the tractor over to the waste oil and ethanol tank once the engine was hot, and he dropped the plow at the near end and let it bite. The engine pulled, and the note dropped and held, and the furrows turned dark and even behind him, and there was no diesel in the working tank at all. He went end to end, turned, came back, and the tractor never stumbled. Exhaust trailed out, smelling different, like burnt cooking oil, and something sharp underneath, and it smoked less than the straight waste oil had, and the engine temperature held right where it should. He finished the pass and shut the tractor down at the field's edge and climbed off. Ray walked over and looked at the turned ground, and then at the tank, and then at Walt. "No diesel, no diesel," Walt said. "How long?" "Long enough to plow a field." Walt wiped his hands on a rag and looked back at the furrows. "Long enough to matter, if it ever had to." It stayed private. Walt didn't tell the county, and Ray didn't either, because Ray had started to understand that the point wasn't the showing. Walt plowed his ground on fuel he'd made from what everyone else had thrown away, and he put the tractor up and cleaned the lines and went inside, and the county never heard a word about it. That evening, after Ray had gone, Walt walked to the fence line at the top of the place and looked out over the neighbors' fields. The new tractors sat in their sheds under their tarps, each one clean and quiet and dependent on bought diesel and a dealer's laptop to clear a fault code or pair a sensor. Walt stood there a long time with his hands in his pockets and said nothing, and the contrast said everything for him. His tractor ran on what the county threw out and could be fixed with what he had in the shop. Theirs ran on what the county bought and could only be fixed by someone 3 towns over with a password he didn't have. He didn't wish a crisis on anyone, and he didn't have to. He'd built something that didn't need one to be worth building, and that was enough for him, and he went inside and ate his supper and slept the way a man sleeps when he's done what he set out to do. The fuel stopped coming in October, which was the wrong month for it, because the ground was ready and the window to plant the winter wheat was already narrow. It didn't come as a single announcement. The co-op put a sign on the diesel pump first, a handwritten one that said out of product until further notice, and by the next morning the 2 stations in the county had done the same, and by the end of the week a man couldn't buy off-road diesel anywhere within 3 counties of Cedar. A co-op manager who couldn't say when delivery would resume told anyone who asked that it was a supply chain problem upstream, and when was the only word that mattered to anyone with a field waiting. The reason didn't much matter to the people who needed the fuel, and the story shifted every time someone told it. A pipeline problem, a refinery down, a distribution snarl somewhere east, the kind of supply chain trouble that sounds like a far-off thing until the pump goes dry in your own town. What mattered was the effect. The tractors were full of nothing, and the fields were waiting, and the calendar didn't care about any of it. October doesn't wait for a man to figure out his fuel, and the ground that's ready today is mud by the middle of next month, and everyone in the county knew it and felt it in their chest. The modern tractors failed for two reasons, and the second one was the one nobody had planned for. A few farmers had a quarter tank left and tried to stretch it, and the machines threw fault codes over fuel pressure and emission sensors and shut themselves down to protect themselves, the way they'd been programmed to. And the farmers couldn't clear the codes because the software to do it lived at the dealer, and the dealer was backed up with every other farmer in the same fix. The machines were protecting themselves. A tractor would sit in a field bricked by its own computer, over a sensor that cost $20, and the man who owned it couldn't swap the sensor and reset the code without a laptop he wasn't allowed to have. One farmer ordered the part himself, had it in his hand by noon, and still couldn't use it because the machine wouldn't recognize the new sensor until a dealer technician logged in and paired it, and the nearest technician was 9 days out and counting. Curtis was the first one who looked like he might lose the year. He farmed 180 acres on a loan he'd taken against the harvest, and the winter wheat had to go in that week, or the bank would start asking questions he couldn't answer. He drove 3 counties over for fuel and came back with 4 jerry cans and a tank that wouldn't cover 40 acres, and his new tractor threw a code on the second pass and locked itself out, and the dealer couldn't get a technician out for 9 days. Curtis sat in the cab in his own field with the engine dead and the display lit up red, and he understood for the first time that the machine he'd paid 6 figures for didn't actually belong to him when it mattered. The county scrambled. Men borrowed fuel from each other until there was nothing left to borrow, and then they borrowed from relatives 2 counties over until those tanks ran dry too. Some paid prices that made no sense, handed over to sellers who'd driven 4 states to find diesel and marked it up to cover the trouble, and a few of them filled up and got 3 passes in before the tank was empty again, and the field was still half undone. Few tried to get their older mechanical tractors running and found that the ones they'd kept around hadn't been started in years and needed fuel they didn't have either, because nobody had laid up a fuel store for a machine they only used in a pinch. The co-op took names on a list and promised delivery someday, and the calendar turned and the window closed a little more every morning, and the ground didn't wait. Walt watched it happen from his shop. He hadn't said a word to anyone about the blend, and Ray had kept the secret, and the tractor sat inside with a full tank of fuel they'd made themselves out of what the county had been throwing away all summer. Walt didn't gloat, and he didn't advertise, because that wasn't how he was built, but he watched the empty pumps and the silent fields and the red displays glowing in cabs all over the county, and he waited for what he knew would come. It came on a Tuesday. Curtis pulled into Walt's lane at dusk, his truck muddy, his face the color of someone who hadn't slept well in a week. He'd driven past the shop 100 times and never stopped, because Walt's operation had always looked like a museum of things that ought to have been scrapped. Climbing out, he stood by the truck and looked at the shop doors, and when Walt came out, Curtis didn't lead with pride. He led with the field. "I've got 180 acres and no way to turn it," Curtis said. "I heard a rumor about your tractor." Walt looked at him for a long moment. "What rumor?" "That it runs on something other than diesel." Curtis took his hat off and turned it in his hands. "I'm not here to laugh, Walt. I'm out of time." Walt nodded once. Slow, the way he did everything. "Bring your plow over in the morning." Walt plowed Curtis's first 40 acres on the blend before noon, and the tractor pulled steady the whole way, the engine note dropping into the load and holding, the exhaust trailing a thin smoke that smelled like nothing the field had ever smelled before. Curtis walked the furrows behind him for the first pass, and then stopped walking and just watched from the gate, and he didn't say much, just stood there, with his arms folded and his jaw set, the way a man stands when he's watching something he didn't believe was possible happen in front of him. When Walt shut down to refuel from the drum on the trailer, Curtis came over and looked at the tank, and looked at Walt, and said, "That's not diesel," and it wasn't a question. "It's not," Walt said. Curtis didn't ask what it was. Not then, because the field was turning and the window was open and the why of it could wait. They finished his ground by the end of the next day, and Curtis went home. And the next morning there were 2 trucks parked in Walt's lane before the sun was up. The line grew the way news moves in a county, which is faster than any pump can keep up with. By the end of the week, there were 8 farms waiting, and Walt couldn't fuel them all from his own barrels, so the thing changed shape. He stopped just plowing for people and started teaching them, because the fuel wasn't the point. The knowing was. Ray set up a second filter rig in the shop yard, and Walt brought the men in 2 at a time and showed them how to settle the oil, how to filter it down, how to heat it and cut the ethanol in and keep the blend from separating. The grease pencil ledger went to anyone who'd take it, and he let them copy the ratio in their own handwriting. Not everyone could do it, and a few of them ruined injectors the first week trying to rush it, and Walt drove over and helped them clean the pumps and started them again with more patience than they'd earned. But the work spread. By the second week, there were 4 old mechanical tractors running in the county on fuel. Their owners had made them cells, and the fields that had been sitting empty started to turn. Men who hadn't held a wrench in years were back in their shops learning the names of the parts they'd been paying someone else to replace, and a few of them pulled their own old iron out of the tree line and got it running for the first time in a decade, because for the first time in a long time they had a reason to. Dale Harper showed up on a Friday, and that was the moment the county understood that something had actually shifted. Dale's new tractor was still dead, the fault code still locked, the dealer still promising a technician next week, and his ground was the last large field in the county still unplanted. He pulled into Walt's yard and sat in his truck for a minute before he got out, and a couple of the other men who were there waiting looked at the ground and said nothing. Walt was by the filter rig, showing a younger farmer how to bleed a line. He looked up when Dale walked over, and he didn't say anything, because he didn't need to. Dale stood there a second. "I called it a junkyard special." "You did," Walt said. Dale looked at the tractor, at the turned fields beyond the shop, at the barrels and the rig, and the men learning to make their own fuel. He took his hat off the way Curtis had, and he said I was wrong about that. And it came out plain, the way the truest things do, with no performance in it. Walt nodded once, and he pointed Dale toward the second filter rig, and he started at the beginning, the way he started with all of them. The last field went in before the deadline, and the crisis passed the way crises do, slowly and then all at once, and the fuel started coming back to the co-op in dribbles, and then in full. The new tractors woke up again as the dealer cleared the codes and the tanks filled, and the county went back to work on the machines it had paid a lot of money for. But something had moved underneath the surface that didn't move back. Men who'd learned to blend their own fuel kept the rigs, and they kept the old tractors, and they didn't quite trust the quiet new machines the way they had before, because they'd seen what happened when the pump went dry and the laptop wasn't theirs. That evening, Walt wiped the old tractor down and set the grease pencil ledger on the bench, full of failures that kept the county's ground turning. The junkyard special had outlasted every machine that laughed at it. For more stories from the backroads, subscribe to Rust and Roots. When something breaks down and no one can help you, the question is, who in your county already knows how to fix it?